A brisk autumn wind swept through the quiet suburban street as Officer Garrett Miller adjusted his mirrored sunglasses, leaning casually against his patrol car. His badge gleamed in the pale sunlight, a stark contrast to the shadowed look in his eyes. Garrett prided himself on his instincts. To him, spotting trouble was second nature, like a sixth sense honed over years on the force. Today his gut told him the black SUV cruising down the street was out of place. The driver, a poised black woman dressed in professional attire, didn't fit his narrow narrative of who should belong in this neighborhood. License and registration, Garrett said gruffly, his tone leaving little room for argument. The woman inside the car, her expression calm yet unreadable, reached for her documents with a composure that unnerved him. She handed them over silently, her eyes meeting his through the window. They weren't defiant or pleading, just steady. Something about her gaze made Garrett falter for a split second, but he brushed it off. He had a routine, and routines brought order. He scanned her license, the name Dr. Aisha Harper staring back at him. The title barely registered in his mind. Instead, he leaned into his typical assumptions, letting them guide his actions. "What brings you to this area?" he asked, his voice tinged with suspicion. Aisha didn't flinch. "Work," she replied simply, her tone clipped but polite. "What kind of work?" Garrett pressed, already forming his own conclusions. She paused, a faint smile playing at her lips as if she were debating whether to answer. "I'm in law enforcement," she said finally. A calm delivery threw him off for a second, but Garrett wasn't about to let her intimidate him. "Law enforcement, huh?" He chuckled dryly, disbelief dripping from every word. "What exactly does that mean?" Instead of responding, Aisha glanced at her watch, the subtle motion infuriating him more than any sharp retort. It was as though she wasn't taking him seriously. "I need you to step out of the car, ma'am," Garrett said, his voice hardening. Aisha raised an eyebrow. "On what grounds, officer?" she asked, her tone still unshaken but carrying an unmistakable edge. His jaw tightened. "Failure to comply will only make this harder for you." For a long moment, neither moved. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut, and Garrett could feel his control of the situation slipping, though he didn't understand why. This wasn't going how it usually did. People were supposed to be nervous, apologetic, anything but this. Finally, Aisha exhaled a long, measured breath. "All right, officer. Let's get this over with," she said, opening the door and stepping out with a grace that felt almost rehearsed. Garrett noticed the sharpness of her blazer, the pristine condition of her shoes. She wasn't just dressed well. She was dressed like someone who expected to command a room. The moment she stood, he felt a subtle shift. It wasn't just her stature, though she carried herself with undeniable authority. It was the way she looked at him, like she was studying him, reading him in a way that made his stomach knot. "Hands on the hood," he barked, determined to reclaim control. Aisha complied without a word, but as Garrett reached for his radio to call in her plates, a voice came through the device that made his blood run cold. "This is dispatch. Be advised, the vehicle belongs to Dr. Aisha Harper, head of Internal Affairs." Garrett froze. The words didn't make sense at first, like a puzzle with missing pieces. Internal Affairs. His mind scrambled to connect the dots, but the pit forming in his stomach told him he already knew the answer. He looked at Aisha, who was watching him now with a small, knowing smile. It wasn't smug, just patient, like she'd been waiting for this moment. "Is there a problem, officer?" she asked, her voice calm, but laced with unmistakable authority. Garrett didn't answer. For the first time in a long time, he felt completely out of his depth. Garrett's heart pounded in his chest as he lowered the radio, his hand trembling ever so slightly. He looked at Aisha again, his mind racing to process what he'd just heard. Head of Internal Affairs. That title carried a weight he couldn't ignore, no matter how hard he tried to act unaffected. Every cop in the precinct knew what Internal Affairs meant. Scrutiny, investigations, power. They were the ones who could end careers with a single report, the ones who watched from the shadows, waiting for someone to step up. Garrett's throat felt dry, and for the first time in a long time, he found himself at a loss for words. Aisha, meanwhile, stood perfectly still, her posture as composed as ever. She didn't gloat or make a scene. She simply let the silence stretch between them, her calm demeanor speaking volumes. "You seem nervous, officer," she said finally, her tone almost conversational. "Is everything all right?" Garrett forced a cough, trying to shake off the unease creeping up his spine. "I just need to verify a few things," he said, his voice lacking its usual authority. He turned away from her, pretending to check her plates again, but his mind was elsewhere. How had he missed this? How had he not recognized her name? Behind him, Aisha crossed her arms, observing him with quiet curiosity. She wasn't one to enjoy pulling rank, but she also wasn't going to let this slide. Moments like these weren't just personal. They were systemic, woven into the fabric of how people like Garrett operated. She'd seen it too many times before, and every time it stung in a way that felt both familiar and exhausting. "I'm curious, officer," she said, breaking the silence. "What exactly made you pull me over today?" A question caught Garrett off guard. He turned to face her, his mind scrambling for an excuse that wouldn't sound weak. "Your vehicle seemed suspicious," he said, though even he didn't believe the words as they left his mouth. Aisha raised an eyebrow. Suspicious? A black SUV in broad daylight, in a neighborhood like this? Her tone wasn't accusatory, but it was firm, leaving little room for Garrett to wiggle out of the moment. "I got a job to do," he said defensively, his voice rising slightly. "It's about keeping the community safe." Aisha tilted her head, studying him. "And you think pulling over random cars without cause makes people feel safe?" Her words landed like a punch to the gut. Garrett felt the weight of them, the unspoken accusations hanging in the air. He wanted to defend himself, to explain that he wasn't that kind of cop, but the truth was staring him in the face. His assumptions had guided his actions, and now he was paying the price. "I didn't know who you were," he admitted, the words coming out quieter than he intended. Aisha took a step closer, her heels clicking softly against the pavement. "And if I weren't me? If I were just another black woman driving through this neighborhood, what would happen then?" Her voice was steady, but there was a sharpness beneath it, a frustration that had been simmering for years. Garrett didn't answer. He couldn't. Instead, he looked down at the ground, his confidence unraveling by the second. He felt exposed, as if every decision he'd made in his career was being dissected under a microscope. Aisha sighed softly, her expression softening just a fraction. "Look, Officer Miller," she said, her tone less confrontational now. "I'm not here to ruin your day, but this, what just happened, is exactly why I do what I do. People like you need to understand that your choices have consequences, not just for you, but for the people you serve." Her words hung in the air, heavy and unrelenting. Garrett felt the sting of them, but he also felt something else: shame. Deep down he knew she was right. He'd let his biases dictate his actions, and now he was facing the fallout. "Do you have any idea what it's like," Aisha continued, her voice laced with emotion, "to constantly be seen as a threat? No matter how you dress or speak or act, to have to prove over and over again that you belong, that you're human?" Garrett swallowed hard, the lump in his throat making it difficult to breathe. He wanted to say something, anything, to break the tension, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, he stood there, feeling smaller than he ever had in his life. Aisha glanced at her watch again, a subtle reminder of the time she was losing. "I have a meeting to get to," she said, her tone still firm but not unkind. "But this conversation isn't over. I'll be filing a report, officer. Not to destroy your career, but to make sure you, and others like you, learn from this." Garrett nodded silently, his mind too clouded with regret to form a proper response. As she turned to get back into her car, he felt a pang of desperation. He didn't want to be remembered as just another bad cop. He wanted to do better, to be better, but he didn't know where to start. Before she closed the car door, Aisha paused and looked at him one last time. "Think about what happened here today," she said, "and ask yourself if this is the kind of officer you want to be." With that, she got into her car and drove away, leaving Garrett standing alone on the side of the road. The world around him seemed quieter now, the weight of her words pressing down on him like a heavy fog. He knew this wasn't the end of the story, not for her, and certainly not for him. But as he watched her car disappear into the distance, he couldn't shake the feeling that his life, and his career, had just changed forever. As Aisha's SUV faded from view, Garrett remained rooted in place, his mind replaying the encounter over and over. The weight of her words pressed on him, making it hard to focus. He'd been on the job for years, but this was the first time someone had made him feel like a rookie all over again. His instincts, once a source of pride, now felt like a liability. Slowly he climbed back into his patrol car, his hands gripping the steering wheel tighter than necessary. The radio crackled to life, dispatch calling out a routine update, but Garrett barely registered it. All he could hear was Aisha's voice, calm yet commanding, dissecting his every move with precision. He shook his head, trying to snap himself out of it. He had a job to do, and sitting here wallowing in self-pity wasn't going to help. But as he put the car in drive, a thought struck him. What if she wasn't just filing a report? What if this went beyond paperwork? The idea sent a chill down his spine. Meanwhile, Aisha was already on her way to her next meeting, her focus shifting from the encounter to the larger picture. She didn't have time to dwell on one officer's mistakes. Her job was about the system as a whole. Yet something about Garrett lingered in her mind. He hadn't been overtly aggressive or hostile, but his assumptions were a stark reminder of why her work was so necessary. As the head of internal affairs, Aisha had seen it all: the blatant misconduct, the subtle biases, the systemic failures that eroded trust between the police and the communities they served. Garrett was just one thread in a much larger tapestry, but every thread mattered. When she arrived at the precinct for her scheduled meeting, the atmosphere shifted the moment she walked through the doors. Officers who recognized her avoided eye contact, their conversations quieting as she passed. Aisha was used to it. Her presence often brought discomfort, but it wasn't personal. It was the weight of her role. She was there to hold people accountable, and that kind of authority made most officers uneasy. Inside the conference room, the precinct captain greeted her with a mix of formality and thinly veiled wariness. "Dr. Harper," he said, extending a hand. "Good to see you." Aisha shook his hand firmly. "Captain," she replied. "Thank you for accommodating me on short notice." The meeting was about an unrelated matter, a review of recent incidents involving use of force in the field. But as Aisha went through her notes, her thoughts kept drifting back to Garrett. She hadn't mentioned the encounter to anyone yet, but she knew she would. Not as a personal vendetta, but as an opportunity to address something deeper. Bias wasn't always overt. It was often insidious, lurking in the background of routine actions, shaping outcomes in ways that were hard to quantify but impossible to ignore. Back on patrol, Garrett tried to shake off the unease, but it clung to him like a shadow. He couldn't help but wonder what Aisha's next move would be. Would she report him immediately? Would he get called into a meeting, blindsided by questions he wasn't prepared to answer? The uncertainty gnawed at him, making it hard to focus on the tasks at hand. For the first time in years, he felt genuinely nervous about his future. His shift ended without incident, but the tension didn't leave him. Instead of heading home, Garrett found himself driving aimlessly through the city, his thoughts tangled. He thought about the years he'd spent on the force, the sacrifices he'd made, and the pride he once felt in wearing the badge. When had things changed? When had he become the kind of officer people feared instead of respected? Eventually, he pulled into a quiet park and sat on a bench, watching the sun dip below the horizon. The air was cool, the sound of distant traffic mingling with the rustle of leaves. He pulled out his phone and searched Aisha's name, curious to know more about the woman who'd turned his day upside down. The search results were overwhelming. Articles about her career, interviews where she spoke passionately about reform, accolades for her work in holding officers accountable. Garrett read through them, each word adding another layer to the image of the woman he'd met. She wasn't just a figurehead, she was a force to be reckoned with. The more he learned, the more he realized how much was at stake, not just for him, but for the people he was supposed to serve. As Garrett sat there, lost in thought, his phone buzzed. It was a message from his partner, Mike. "Hey, heard you pulled over someone big today. What happened?" The message made his stomach twist. Word was already getting around, and he hadn't even begun to process it himself. He stared at the screen, debating whether to respond, but before he could decide, another message came through. "Careful, man. Air doesn't play." Garrett sighed, setting the phone down. He wasn't sure what frustrated him more, his own actions or the way the department seemed to view accountability as a threat rather than a necessity. He knew Mike meant well, but the message only reinforced the us versus them mentality that had been drilled into him over the years. The next morning, Aisha sat in her office, reviewing reports from her team. Her schedule was packed, but she kept thinking about Garrett. Something about their interaction felt unresolved, like an open case file waiting for closure. She decided to request his personnel file, not out of malice, but out of curiosity. She wanted to understand what kind of officer he was beyond the 10 minutes they'd spent together on the side of the road. As she skimmed through the file, she saw a man who, on paper, seemed competent and dedicated. But there were also red flags, complaints from civilians, minor infractions that had been swept under the rug, patterns that pointed to deeper issues. It wasn't enough to paint him as a bad cop, but it was enough to make her wonder how much of his behavior was driven by the culture he operated in. A knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. It was one of her investigators holding a folder. "Dr. Harper, we got another case that might interest you," they said, placing the folder on her desk. Aisha opened it and scanned the contents. The details were different, but the underlying issues were the same: bias, misuse of authority, a system that allowed problems to fester instead of addressing them head-on. She sighed, feeling the familiar weight of the work she committed her life to. The road ahead was long and the challenges were many. But as she closed the folder and looked out the window, Aisha felt a renewed sense of purpose. The system wasn't going to change overnight, but every step forward mattered. And whether Garrett realized it or not, he was now part of that journey. The sun barely crested the horizon when Garrett arrived at the precinct the next morning. His usual routine of coffee and small talk felt hollow, replaced by a gnawing tension in his chest. As he walked through the halls, he couldn't shake the feeling that eyes were on him. Whispers followed in his wake, subtle but unmistakable. It seemed like everyone had heard about the woman he'd stopped, but no one was saying it outright. He settled into his desk, pretending to ignore the glances from his colleagues. His partner, Mike, dropped into the chair beside him, a grin playing on his face. "Morning, superstar," Mike said, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "Word is you managed to tick off the head of internal affairs. That's got to be some kind of record." Garrett forced a chuckle, but the joke didn't land. "It wasn't like that," he muttered, flipping through the papers on his desk, trying to appear busy. "Sure it wasn't," Mike replied, leaning in conspiratorially. "But you know how these things go. She's probably already got your name highlighted in some report. I'd watch your step if I were you." Garrett didn't respond, the weight of Mike's words settling heavily on his shoulders. He wanted to brush it off, to tell himself that this was just another day on the job, but deep down, he knew better. Aisha Harper wasn't the kind of person to let things slide, and he wasn't sure if he wanted her to. Across town, Aisha was already deep into her work, her mind racing through the layers of bureaucracy she needed to navigate. Garrett's file sat on the corner of her desk, a small but nagging reminder of the encounter that had set her day in motion. She'd spent hours the previous night replaying their interaction, dissecting every word, every gesture. It wasn't just about him. It was about the culture he represented, the system she was fighting to change. She reached for the file, flipping it open once more. There was nothing in it that screamed corruption or malice, but there was something about the pattern of complaints, the vague justifications, and the lack of accountability that troubled her. She'd seen it before in officers who started with good intentions, but were slowly worn down by the culture around them. Garrett wasn't the worst she'd encountered, but he wasn't an outlier either. The day passed in a blur for both of them, the weight of their respective roles pressing down like a storm cloud. For Garrett, every interaction felt like it carried more weight than usual, every glance from a colleague laced with unspoken judgment. For Aisha, the endless stream of reports and meetings only reinforced the scale of the challenge she faced.